Before you can understand why a metal box changed the world, you have to understand what a port looked like before it existed. Because the old system wasn't just slower, it was a completely different kind of economic bottleneck, one that shaped what got shipped, where factories were built, and how much almost everything cost. Picture a cargo ship arriving at a major port in the middle of the 20th century. Its hold isn't filled with uniform boxes stacked in orderly rows. It's filled with what the industry called break bulk cargo, thousands of individual items packed in an enormous variety of shapes and sizes. Sacks of coffee beans, crates of machine parts, barrels of chemicals, bundles of lumber, loose bags of grain. Each item had arrived at the dock separately, was loaded separately, and would eventually be unloaded separately, by hand, by a team of dock workers using ropes, hooks, pallets, and physical strength to move each individual piece from the dock into a cargo net or sling, up into the air by crane, and down into the ship's hold, where more workers would then manually arrange it to fit efficiently around everything already stowed there. The way you'd pack an oddly shaped suitcase, except the suitcase weighed thousands of tons and the packing had to be done by hundreds of people working in coordinated shifts. This process was extraordinarily labor-intensive, and labor-intensive in shipping doesn't just mean expensive, it means slow. And slow at a port means a ship sitting idle at the dock instead of earning money at sea. A cargo ship only makes money while it's moving goods between ports. Every day it spends tied up at the dock, being loaded or unloaded by hand, is a day it's not earning anything, and in the break bulk era, loading and unloading a single medium-sized ship could take not hours but days, sometimes more than a week, depending on the size and variety of the cargo. Studies from the period estimated that a ship might spend nearly half of its total operating life sitting in port rather than sailing, simply waiting for cargo to be moved on and off by hand. That inefficiency showed up directly in the cost of the goods themselves. Because handling costs were so high, and because theft and damage were rampant in ports where thousands of loose items passed through countless human hands, a problem so common it had its own name in the industry, the friendly touch of the longshoremen, a significant share of the retail price of many shipped goods wasn't the cost of making the product at all. It was the cost of physically moving it through ports, a cost baked into everything from imported fruit to industrial machinery, adding up across an entire economy built on inefficient cargo handling as an accepted, unavoidable fact of life. This is the word the shipping container was actually invented to solve, and it's worth being precise about what the real innovation was, because the popular version of this story tends to flatten it into something smaller and less interesting than what actually happened. The idea of putting cargo into a large, reusable box wasn't itself especially novel. Various forms of standardized containers had existed in limited, local use for decades before the version most people associate with modern shipping became dominant. The genuinely hard problem, the one that actually took decades to solve, wasn't the box. It was getting an entire global industry, made up of fiercely competing companies and governments with no shared incentive to cooperate, to agree on exactly the same box. To see why that agreement mattered more than the object itself, imagine a slightly different, much less useful version of the same idea. A shipping company decides on its own to load cargo into large standardized boxes for its own ships. That company gains a real efficiency advantage on its own routes. Loading and unloading becomes faster, because instead of handling thousands of individual items, dock workers are now handling a smaller number of large uniform units that a crane can lift as a single piece. But the advantage stops the moment that box needs to leave the ship. If the destination port doesn't have cranes built to handle that exact size and weight of box, the container is useless there. It has to be opened and unloaded the old-fashioned way anyway. If the receiving railway's flat cars aren't built to the same width and locking mechanism, the box can't simply be lifted onto a train. If the trucking company that needs to carry it, the final distance to a warehouse, doesn't have a chassis designed for that container's specific corner fittings, it can't be picked up by road either. A single company's clever box, without agreement from everyone downstream of it, is a local trick, not a global transformation. It solves loading efficiency on one ship, at one port, and creates a mismatch everywhere else in the chain. This is the actual center of the story. The shipping container only became transformative once an entire ecosystem of competing independent actors, shipping lines, port authorities, railway operators, trucking companies, crane manufacturers, and eventually national governments agreed to build around one common physical standard. Not a good idea. A shared standard, and getting there required solving a coordination problem that was, in a very real sense, harder than the engineering problem of the box itself. The technical specifics of that standard matter here because they explain why agreement was so difficult in the first place. A workable universal container needed a fixed set of exact dimensions, length, width, and height, consistent enough that a crane built to lift one container could reliably lift any other container built anywhere else in the world. It needed standardized corner castings, the reinforced metal fittings at each corner of the box, engineered to precisely the same specifications so that the same locking mechanism, called a twist lock, could clamp onto any container regardless of who manufactured it, what it was carrying, or which country it came from. It needed a stacking design strong enough that containers could be piled many units high without crushing the ones underneath, and compatible enough that a ship built to carry one company's containers could just as easily carry another company's without modification. Every one of those specifications sounds like a narrow technical detail, but each one represented a real financial fight, because every company that had already invested in a slightly different container size or a slightly different corner locking design stood to lose that investment the moment an incompatible industry standard was adopted instead. Shipping lines that had built their own proprietary container systems, betting on their own dimensions and their own locking hardware, had genuine business reasons to resist switching to somebody else's standard. Doing so meant writing off ships, cranes, and containers they'd already paid for, in favor of a format designed by a competitor. This wasn't a dispute about whether standardization was a good idea in the abstract. Almost everyone agreed the industry, as a whole, would benefit from a shared standard eventually. The fight was about whose specific design would become that standard, because whoever's format won would have a head start advantage, while everyone else would be stuck retrofitting. It took years of negotiation through international standards organizations, competing industry proposals, and no small amount of political pressure before a common set of container dimensions and fittings was finally agreed upon widely enough to function as a true global standard rather than a regional compromise. And even once a standard existed on paper, agreeing to a specification was only the beginning. The much larger cost, the cost that actually determined how fast containerization could spread, was the physical rebuilding of the infrastructure. The entire system depended on port by port, country by country. A port built for break bulk cargo simply could not handle standardized containers without an almost complete physical transformation. The old model relied on rows of small berths, warehouses close to the water's edge for temporary storage, and large numbers of dock workers moving cargo by hand between ship and shore. Containerized shipping required something entirely different. Enormous flat-paved yards where thousands of containers could be stacked and organized by size and destination. Gigantic gantry cranes, tall and strong enough to lift a fully loaded container straight up out of a ship's hold and set it down precisely on a truck chassis or a rail car. And channels deep enough to accommodate ships that were, generation after generation, built larger specifically to carry more containers per voyage and spread the fixed cost of each crossing across a greater volume of cargo. This kind of infrastructure was extraordinarily expensive, and building it meant making a very large bet years before the payoff arrived. A port authority deciding to convert to container handling had to commit enormous capital to cranes, paved yardage, and deepened channels, with no guarantee that shipping lines would actually route enough container traffic through that specific port to make the investment worthwhile, especially in the early years when only a handful of ports anywhere in the world could handle containers at all. This created a genuine chicken and egg problem that slowed adoption for longer than the pure engineering timeline required. Shipping companies were reluctant to fully commit their fleets to containerization until enough ports on their routes could actually handle containerized cargo. Ports were reluctant to make the enormous capital investment in container infrastructure until enough shipping traffic already existed to justify it. Only a combination of early confident bets by a handful of aggressive shipping companies and equally aggressive early moving ports broke that deadlock. And once a critical mass of major ports had made the conversion, the economic pressure on every remaining port to follow became overwhelming. Because a port that couldn't handle containers efficiently was, within a decade or two, effectively cut off from a growing share of world trade. That pressure created a very specific and consequential kind of winner and loser. And this is where the story stops being purely about engineering or logistics and starts being about geography and human livelihoods. Ports that made the early expensive bet on container infrastructure, deepening their channels, building the massive paved yards, installing gantry cranes years before their neighbors did, captured a disproportionate and often lasting share of the shipping traffic that followed, because shipping lines naturally routed toward whichever ports could turn a ship around fastest. Ports that hesitated, whether due to lack of capital, geographic limitations, or resistance from within the industries built around the old system, often found themselves permanently sidelined as regional shipping hubs, even if they had been major, historically important ports for a century or more under the old model. A port's centuries of accumulated history and reputation counted for far less than whether it had, within a specific critical window, made the capital investment the new system demanded. That same shift landed with tremendous force on the people who had built entire careers and communities around the old way cargo moved. Break bulk shipping needed enormous numbers of dock workers, because unloading a ship by hand, item by item, required a large physical workforce organized into shifts, unions, and generations of family employment tied to a specific port. Containerization needed a fraction of that labor. A single gantry crane operator, lifting a fully loaded 40-foot container in one motion, could move as much cargo in an hour as dozens of dock workers, moving break bulk goods by hand across an entire day. This wasn't a small efficiency gain at the margins, it was an order of magnitude reduction in the human labor required to move the same volume of goods, concentrated specifically in port cities that had, for generations, organized entire local economies and communities around waterfront labor. The transition triggered serious, sustained conflict in port cities around the world as dock workers' unions fought through strikes, negotiations, and political pressure over how fast the transition would happen and what would happen to the workforce being displaced by it. Some of these negotiations produced longer transition periods, retraining programs, or negotiated payouts. In other places, the transition happened faster and with less cushioning, and entire waterfront communities that had been built around break bulk labor went into a long, difficult economic decline as the work that had sustained them simply stopped existing at the volume it once had. Once this physical and institutional transformation was largely complete, once a critical mass of the world's major ports, ships, railways, and trucking fleets had converted to the same container standard, the economic effect went well beyond making existing trade routes cheaper and faster. It changed what kinds of trade were economically possible at all, and that's the part of the story that connects most directly to the world people actually live in today. Before containerization, the cost and unpredictability of moving goods across oceans meant that manufacturing tended to happen relatively close to where products would ultimately be sold, because long-distance shipping of finished or partially finished goods was expensive and slow enough to erode any savings gained from cheaper labor or materials elsewhere. Once containerized shipping made ocean freight dramatically cheaper, faster, and critically far more predictable in terms of timing and reduced damage or loss, that calculation changed completely. A factory could now be built on the other side of the planet from its eventual customers, and the cost of shipping a finished product across an ocean could become a genuinely small fraction of that product's total price, rather than a prohibitive expense. This is a large part of what made the global manufacturing pattern that emerged over the following decades economically viable at all, Components made in one country, assembled in another, sold in a third, with each leg of that journey moving through a supply chain built entirely around the assumption that a standard container, loaded once at a factory, could travel by truck, then ship, then rail, then truck again, without ever being opened or repacked until it reached its final destination. That predictability, more than the raw cost savings alone, is really the deeper structural change containerization produced. Businesses could plan production schedules, inventory levels, and retail restocking around shipping timelines that had become, for the first time in the history of long-distance trade, reasonably reliable and consistent. That reliability is what allowed increasingly complex, increasingly global supply chains to be built in the first place. Chains where a single product might combine components manufactured in several different countries, arriving at an assembly point on a tightly coordinated schedule. Something that would have been close to unmanageable under the unpredictable delays and losses of the break bulk era. But this same structural shift, the one that made cheap, complex, globally distributed manufacturing possible, also created a new and different kind of fragility. One that wasn't really a risk in the older, more distributed system it replaced. When cargo handling was slow, expensive, and inconsistent everywhere, no single port or shipping route carried an outsized share of global trade, simply because the whole system was inefficient in a roughly similar way across the board. Containerization concentrated an enormous share of global trade through a comparatively small number of major ports and a limited number of critical shipping corridors. Precisely because efficiency rewards concentration, traffic naturally flows toward the routes and hubs that can move cargo fastest and cheapest, which are the ones that made the earliest, biggest investments in container infrastructure. That concentration is what makes global trade so efficient under normal conditions. It's also exactly what makes a disruption at any one of those critical points ripple outward across the entire global economy, rather than staying contained to a single region the way a disruption in the older, more distributed break bulk system generally would have. A blockage at a single major canal, a labor dispute at one of a handful of dominant ports, a shortage of the specific type of container needed on a specific trade route. Any of these can now delay or disrupt goods moving across dozens of countries simultaneously. Not because any individual link in the chain is unusually fragile, but because so much of global trade has been deliberately funneled through the same small number of efficient choke points that containerization itself made possible and, in effect, encouraged. The very same standardization that eliminated the old system's inefficiency also removed much of its redundancy, because redundancy and efficiency tend to pull in opposite directions. A system with many roughly equal, moderately inefficient routes is naturally resistant to any single point of failure, while a system optimized around a small number of highly efficient choke points gains enormous cost advantages at the price of exactly that kind of resilience. Step back and look at the full arc of this story, and the shipping container itself starts to look almost like the least important part of it. The box is simple. What made the box matter was the decades-long, expensive, often bitterly contested process of getting an entire fragmented global industry, competing shipping lines, competing ports, competing governments, competing labor unions, to agree on one shared physical standard, and then to rebuild trillions of dollars of infrastructure around that agreement, port by port, crane by crane, across the entire planet. That process created winners among the ports and countries that moved early and confidently, created real and lasting hardship among the workers and communities built around the system it replaced, and ultimately made possible a version of global manufacturing and trade that would have been economically unthinkable under the older, slower, more expensive way of moving goods across the world. The container itself hasn't changed much since that standard was first locked in. What changed the world wasn't the box. It was everyone eventually agreeing to build around exactly the same one.